All right, Noah, you're supposed to be the funniest on the team, so you can start us off.
I'm the funniest on the team. I don't know, what makes you think that? Is it just, my appearance?
That's what Andrew designated you. Wasn't it supposed to be Andrew's show? And I feel like he's never actually here on Fridays.
Yeah,
Well,
he's always on vacation in different countries and stuff, living his best life.
I don't even really think that he works. Yeah.
I'm a bit concerned that he's in Taiwan right now while China is engaged in unprecedented war games surrounding the island with ships and planes. So we're a little bit worried about getting Andrew Lawton back safe and sound in one piece.
Not an asset. It's not maybe a low-key Chinese agent. Who knows?
No, maybe I feel bad. Maybe we shouldn't be saying unkind things about him while he's in a dangerous zone.
Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, I understand he's getting on a plane home today, so I think he'll be okay.
All right, well, in that case, Andrew, this is your show. You need to come back and you need to start hosting it more regularly. We're happy to all be guests, but it's your show, your responsibility. All right, everyone, let's get it started. Hey everyone, welcome back to Off the Record, Friday's fun show. Andrew Lawton is out of town in Taiwan, as you may have heard, so I am filling in his absence, and I am joined by William McBeath and Noah Jarvis. Thanks both for joining me today, guys.
Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to be on.
So it's been a spicy week in Canadian politics. Actually, it seems like there is probably not much going on, and you always know that it's been a slow news week, and when they're down in the polls, when the Liberals start talking about abortion. The Liberals are once again fear-mongering over abortion, saying that the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, if he was in government, if he was in power, he would make abortion illegal. Personally, I'm pro-life. I don't have a problem with this. Unfortunately, Pierre Poilievre has actually said he would do nothing to legislate it. So the Liberals don't really have much of an argument, but they always seem to bring this up when they're down the polls. And we have many polls showing them down by as many as 20 points. Still, this has been what they've chosen to make the issue of the week about. And there was a pretty crazy press conference that broke out in Ottawa this week. We're going to play a clip to show you what the Liberals sounded like this week in Ottawa.
I'm here representing the Women's Caucus and members of the Liberal Party, and we've sent a letter to the Leader of the Opposition asking him to be very clear with Canadians, and in particular with Canadian women, on what he would do to defend a woman's right to choose. We've seen that his caucus, there are many anti-choice caucus members. We've seen some of their actions recently, including MP Kathy Wagenthal, who at the pro-life rally held here last week said that women who have abortions end up needing redemption, forgiveness, and needing God. We as women want to know whether the Leader of the Opposition will ensure that his caucus does not put forward legislation that in any way impinges on women's rights and freedoms, in particular bodily autonomy.
So, of course, now the Liberals are saying they're putting forward the dreaded letter, which is what politicians always do when they don't really have anything else to do. William, what do you make of this? Why is this coming up again?
Yeah, I mean, you've heard of the little boy who cried wolf. Well, this is the little party that cried abortion. It's every single time they're faced with policy criticism or sagging popularity, they go to their only weapon left. They try and claim that the Conservative Party in government would outlaw abortion. But unlike in previous times, I think you're seeing that even the legacy media aren't believing it now. They're saying, look, we had 10 years of Harper government. There were no changes to abortion under that. The leader, Pierre Poilievre, has been very clear about where he stands, saying he won't legislate on abortion. So they pushed back a bit, which was good to see. I also have to laugh and say there seems to be an awful lot of men in the Liberal Women's Caucus based on that photo. Or maybe they choose to identify as women now. That could be, I guess, what it is too.
I think you raise a good point, and also you're correct. The mainstream media actually did push back on this. They don't often push back on this, but there's actually some good questions. Let's go a little bit to that back and forth that we saw between the minister speaking and the Liberal MP speaking, and some of the questions from reporters in the room were actually really challenging the Women's Caucus, as you mentioned, and some of their points. Let's play that clip now.
Is it? He was here. The Harper government had 10 years. I know you weren't here. Many of us were. 10 years in power. They had 4 years as a majority, didn't move one bit. And they had private members who wanted to do things. Guys, you are all 30 points down the polls. I'm looking at some of you will not get reelected if there was an election this fall. This is the most cynical play to just throw the abortion scare tactic. Would you like to respond to that observation?
Absolutely. It's
Please.
not a scare tactic. We've seen what's happened in the States. Do people really think Roe versus Wade would have been overturned? Do we think what was happening there was going to happen? I've been in the women's movement for over 50 years. It is not a scare tactic. Things are going backwards, not only in Canada, but around the world. And these are real risks for Canadians. We need to know very clearly that that party, policies put forth at the convention, individual members are not going to introduce things because we do not want to go the same way as the United States. So it is not a scare tactic. It is a very strong concern. And I may not have been here then, but I was other places working on women's rights, okay? So do not use that as a reason why it's not a scare tactic.
Last question.
Let's just put it back the other way. The government hasn't also legislated to protect abortions either, right? So why doesn't your government introduce legislation to make it harder for that to get rolled back if there is a conservative government?
You do not want to legislate woman's body. You do not legislate woman's body. That is not, you make sure that you have access to abortion. You don't want to legislate anybody's body, particularly a woman's.
Even if that is to protect the right to choose, like you're calling
No,
to do?
you don't want to legislate your ovaries, your uterus. No, that is not the way that you protect women's rights.
I find these clips so difficult to listen to. You don't want to legislate women's bodies. They always forget when they make these arguments that when we're talking about abortion, there's two bodies at play here. There's also the little baby that's growing inside its mother, totally innocent, helpless little child. But of course, the Liberals don't want to acknowledge that reality. That first question there from the reporter was very interesting, though. He was actually very indignant. You could see that even the legacy media is tired of this ploy from the Liberals. He actually even said to them, oh, you guys are down 30 points. I mentioned earlier, they're down pretty consistently 20 points, but he even went to say 30 points. Noah, do you think that this is simply just the Liberals trying to distract because they are doing so poorly in the poll numbers, or do you think there's something more at play here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're trying to distract. I mean, if an election were held today, more than half of the Liberal caucus would lose their seats. So it is within their best interest to try and lie and portray the Conservatives as, some crazy Christian radicals who want to roll back women's rights. But the fact of the matter is this, on Pierre Poilievre's campaign trail, when he was campaigning for the Conservative leadership, he made it very clear that he would not seek to legislate abortions in any way, shape, or form. And to my dismay and your dismay, he will not be taking on this issue. And, it's for good reason. I think the pro-life movement in Canada has a lot of work to do to make abortion restrictions more popular in Canada. But Pierre Poilievre has never said at all that he wants to legislate abortions. He said the opposite, in fact. And when the reporters questioned the Liberal MPs on this, they just talk about not trying to scare the Canadian public, and then they immediately talk about the United States, a completely different country with different legal jurisdiction and a different judicial system. They talk about Roe v. Wade, where Canada doesn't really have an equivalent of Roe v. Wade. You could point to R.V. Morgenthaler in 1988 and 1993, but those court decisions don't necessarily say that you can't legislate abortion in any way, whereas Roe v. Wade, it was sort of the gates that held back the flood of democratic choice in the United States. So I don't think that there is a really big constituency that wants to see abortion regulated, even if you and I want to see that, Rachel. And B, Pierre Poilievre has no desire to do this. And even if one of his private member's bill hits the House of Commons and the government votes against it, and I'm pretty sure all Liberal MPs and NDP MPs would vote against it, there's just no way that sort of bill would pass in Parliament. So it is a Liberal scare tactic, no matter what they say.
Yeah, so those Liberals MPs are saying, Pierre Poilievre, if in government, he would use the notwithstanding clause to ban abortion. He personally wants to legislate to make abortion illegal. Of course, his office has responded and said that isn't the case. But I think you raise a really good point here, Noah, that the Liberals are saying that, the Liberals are being accused of fear-mongering. And they say, no, we're not fear-mongering. Look at what's happening in the United States. And by doing that, they themselves are fear-mongering because it's a totally different country. It's run very differently. The pro-life movement is much stronger in the U.S. And the Liberals always seem to revert back to this when they are trying to scare Canadians. Oh, we've got Trumpism style Canadians. We all remember that sort of infamous video when Pierre Poilievre was being interviewed while he was in Western Canada. And, he was accused of bringing Trump style politics to Canada. And he was saying, oh, who's saying this? Who's saying that I'm like Trump? And the reporter had no basis, no way of backing this up. One of the other things that kind of comes to mind with this is that we know Pierre Poilievre in the polls has struggled a little bit with sort of middle-class women in the Toronto GTA area. Of course, that's always a battleground in federal elections. We know the Conservatives are going to be looking to that. After we saw those poll numbers come out, we sort of saw Pierre Poilievre get a makeover, stopped wearing the glasses, maybe was wearing a little bit of face makeup. There were some accusations, and I have no idea if this is true or not, that he was even wearing one of those like undercoatings under his shirt that has like the fake muscles and stuff. All this from Liberals probably isn't true. It was sort of funny to watch at the time. But William, what do you make of this? Is this really just more of the Liberals' tactics, trying to make Pierre Poilievre unpopular with a specific group of people in Canada because they are seeing their poll numbers and they're getting a little worried for the next federal election?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting. The Liberal government has always reached for, it seems, two issues when they were trying to, quote unquote, scare back their supporters. One was abortion, the other was guns and gun control. And I think you've seen in both cases, those wells have run dry. There is no legitimate fear on the part of everyday Canadians on either of the conservative approach to either gun control or abortion. You are completely right. Canada is very different than the United States. We have a much less influential and wide-ranging pro-life movement. We don't have the same pro-life politics that exist in the Republican Party that does in the Conservative Party, and less of a Canadian appetite for any change on this. So for the Liberals to keep going back to it, it really shows how out of ideas they are. They put forward their budget. It was an absolute flop. Didn't move a single supporter back into their camp. They've said they're all about building houses. Not a single house has been built under new Liberal programs. So what they're going to is what's always worked before. But I think this time, again, as I said, that well has just run dry.
And as a government, let me just say, as a government that's been in power for over 9 years, and the reporter mentioned this, they had so much opportunity to legislate abortion rights into Canadian law, but they have not done that. And the really crappy retort that one of the MPs gave is, "Oh, we will not legislate women's bodies," and starts mentioning specific parts. But we do this all the time. With the Canada Health Act and various other laws, we legislate people's bodies all the time. I mean, that's what they did during the pandemic when they're forcing people to get vaccines much unless they want to have their rights severely restricted. I mean, we legislate people's bodies all the time. So to act like this is something that is beyond the pale, that we cannot reach this measure as a Canadian society, it is ridiculous. We do this all the time. And just saying it over and over again, we will not legislate women's bodies. It's not going to do anything. You're just wrong,
Yeah, it's just one of their classic talking points, completely ignoring the fact that the right to life is one of the most basic human rights, whether that's enshrined in a constitution or a charter or whatever. That is a basic right that we all inherently have, and that right is stolen from babies before they're even out of the womb. But of course, as we mentioned, they conveniently ignore these realities time and time again. Of course, ignoring reality is sort of becoming more commonplace for the Liberals. Now, we've talked a lot about this story being a distraction for their low polling numbers, but they also had some other bad news from Meta this week. William, why don't you break down that story for us?
Yeah, well, as you know, the Liberal government's Online News Act came in force last year, and it sought to make big tech companies, specifically Google and Meta, who owns Facebook and Instagram, have to pay news publishers for the privilege of having their content posted on their platforms. Google said, well, we don't really like this, but okay, we'll give you $100 million a year in order to get you off our backs. I think Meta simply decided they had enough, and Meta said, fine, we won't include any Canadian news content on our platforms. And here we are now, coming up on 8 or 9 months after that law was implemented. And the clear winner here has been Meta. And the reasons we can cite is, first of all, Canadians in record numbers are still signing up to Meta properties, to Facebook, to Instagram. Viewership, readership, usership of these platforms hasn't declined, and advertising revenue has continued to grow. I think something like 19% year over year compared to it, because Meta's always said it isn't a news platform. It doesn't really see a lot of traffic because of news content. And in fact, the people who really benefit from having news content posted on Instagram and Facebook are the news companies who get vast more amounts of exposure. And that's true. If you look at especially small and independent media outlets, they've seen massive drops, calamitous drops in their exposure after the Meta and ban getting them off Facebook and Instagram. So I think the government should pat itself on the back, say, job well done. Our new law to help the news industry has massively hurt the news industry. That's a great job. Everybody gets a cigar.
The really ridiculous thing about this story is that we all knew exactly how this was going to play out, because the same thing happened in Australia a few years back when they wanted to legislate this type of thing, have Facebook pay news companies for already giving them a benefit by being able to share their work on Facebook's platform and receiving lots of clicks and visits to the website that way. When that happened, Facebook in Australia just said, okay, we're not going to allow link sharing anymore. And they briefly banned it. Now they were able to come to a deal with Facebook at the time, now Meta, and sort of work through that. But here in Canada, we haven't been able to overcome that. We can't share our news. Now I know a lot of people have been able to find little workarounds. A lot of people I know, I maybe shouldn't even say them so Meta doesn't get wind, but you might post a picture on Facebook and then post the link in the comments or something and just say, look in the comments below. But obviously, for an outlet like True North, who we did get a lot of business from Facebook. We did get a lot of clicks from Facebook. Now we have to find all these silly workarounds. The reality is when people are scrolling on social media, they're just looking very quickly, and you got to have that attention. You got to have that headline that's going to grab their attention and cause them to actually click on that story and take a look. So I would assume that this has just been a massive blow for us, as well as some of the other independent media outlets that you mentioned. I'm sure Rebel has experienced, drawbacks, Western Standard. William, obviously you sort of run the operations. Maybe you could speak to specifically what the impact has been for us at True North, not being able to share our work easily on platforms like Facebook.
Yeah, it's interesting. We obviously, like everybody else, used Meta tools. We used Facebook, we used Instagram to reach large swaths of Canadians with our content. I would say one of the things that was great about Facebook is that it allowed you to get in front of a very large audience. Millions and millions and millions of Canadians use it every day. And it allowed you to drive traffic to your videos, to your news stories, and to your other content. But when we saw this bill coming, we realized that it would be a problem for us, that if we were too reliant on Meta properties for our content, we would be in trouble. So we invested in building up our email list, in growing on properties like X, and on making sure that people were visiting our website directly rather than simply linking through to it through Facebook and Instagram posts. And as a result, we've been far less impacted than I think some other organizations have. It's still an issue. We're still seeing a decline in some of our key metrics, but overall, we've been far less badly hurt than some other entities. You have to ask yourself, if the bill is hurting news companies, why wouldn't the government recall it? Why wouldn't they drop it or at least retool it substantially in order to deal with some of these problems? And it seems now that they're just locked in a bitter personal feud with Meta, and in between a Liberal government on life support and Meta, who has record-breaking profits, my money's on Meta, who's going to win this fight.
Noah, so William obviously mentioned a personal feud there, but obviously with independent media being so impacted by this ban, do you think there's more to this? Do you think this is actually maliciousness on the Liberal government's part, actively trying to harm independent media, which has been so critical of their government?
Well, I think it might be malicious on behalf of the mainstream media who lobbied for this legislation. But I think it certainly is incompetence on the Trudeau government's part. I believe that, no matter what they touch, it just they have the reverse Midas touch. Instead of turning into gold, it turns into human defecation. So, I really think that the Liberals, they tried their best to make this legislation help Canadian news. I mean, that's what they claim to, be trying to do as much as possible, giving millions of dollars in media bailouts and, passing Bill C-11 and, this Bill C-18. I think they genuinely thought that, Meta and Google would just, dump their pockets in front of them and, give out a bunch of checks to news media who are failing. But at the end of the day, this is legislation that hurts local news outlets first and foremost. The Trudeau government, they claim to want to be able to support local news, and they give billions of dollars to the CBC to support local news who actually don't support local news, but that's besides the point. But the studies showed that local news outlets have seen a decline in their audience by 86%, and mainstream media, they've only seen a decline about half that. So it is definitely not a bill, not the legislation that is helping local news outlets like the Trudeau government says. And I think that the mainstream media, when they lobbied for this legislation, they have their own lobby that sites like or companies like Post Media and Forestar, they all contribute to this organization that lobbies the government. I believe that they knew that even if Meta banned being able to see Canadian news on their platforms, they still have their newspaper subscriptions. People still know who they are from their reputation built up over decades. So they're more likely to just directly visit their website. There's a lot of other areas in which these legacy media outlets can make money, and they know that outlets like True North and other local media outlets, they don't have the same resources as them. So it's sort of like how when you increase the minimum wage, Walmart generally benefits because they have less competition in the mom and pop shops and the small to medium sized businesses. So I think that if the Trudeau government had sort of any integrity and wanted to follow through on their plan to help news media, they wouldn't continue making this legislation law. They would try and revoke this legislation and bring something forward that would actually help news media. Although I don't want them to try and help news media anymore. They've done enough. They've destroyed trust in these institutions by giving them hundreds of millions of dollars, and they've destroyed their ability to actually reach an audience. So maybe if they didn't touch this file anymore, that'd be for the best.
And when you talk about how this has been so detrimental for local news, the irony is, of course, that the Liberals are spending so much, particularly to bolster local news. We know they spend a lot on news media in general, as you mentioned, but they have sort of a local journalism initiative. You guys have probably seen this in the paper for our audience. If you're ever reading a newspaper and you see beside the author's names, it says in brackets, local journalism initiative, that means that reporter's salary is directly paid for by the federal government. So while news media in general receives hundreds of millions in funding and subsidies, those positions are actually being paid for directly. So, have to always take everything that you read in legacy media with a grain of salt, but those positions are just being paid by the feds. I think it's so wrong that we're seeing that. And yes, now the federal government's spending all this money on these positions, and at the same time, then they're making it impossible for Canadians to find the work that they're spending money paying for, that we're spending money to pay for, because we're actually the taxpayers paying for this. It doesn't make any sense at all. William, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've always said that if your job salary is dependent on the government, how on earth can you possibly fairly cover that government and hold them to account? If you're a media outlet who relies on government subsidies, government transfers, government funding in order to keep the lights on and make payroll, how on earth can you critically cover that government, hold them to account? Because you need them. It's an abusive relationship, almost like between a drug addict and a drug dealer. So, as speaking for True North, we would love nothing more than the government to fully get out of the news business, to leave us alone, to let us do our thing, and to stop meddling in something they clearly don't understand. But I'm not optimistic that we'll see any changes from this government. They've said that they have no plans on doing it. But I'm optimistic that a future government may decide to roll back some of these truly disastrous changes and let us get on with the business of reporting the facts and the truth to Canadians.
Well, we're on the topic of social media. We have a big story from TikTok about TikTok this week. A new report recommends that the Canadian government force TikTok to divest from its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, or announce a national ban to secure Canadians from surveillance, propaganda, and predatory data collection from the communist regime. The Macdonald Laurier Institute report titled China's Glaring Trojan Horse recommends that the federal government mimic the United States TikTok ban legislation by giving ByteDance the option to either sell TikTok to a suitable buyer or face a ban of the app in the country. Okay, so we all know that TikTok has been controversial because, China's collecting so much data on the people that have it downloaded on their phones and are using it. Do you think a ban would be in the best interest of Canadians? No, I'm going to let you go first.
Well, I think this is a really a controversial issue because on one hand we have to balance two principles. One principle being order, and the other being liberty. The on the order side, we do need to ensure that Canada's national security is its integrity is solid. And when we have countries like China that are seeking to undermine Canada's democracy, Canada's institutions, and undermine even sometimes the safety of certain Canadians, especially Chinese Canadians. When we have a government doing that in our country, we need to take every step possible in order to secure the integrity of our elections and the security of our people. And one of the steps that can be taken is by actually getting TikTok to be divested or banned. And the reason being is that TikTok, they have a lot of mechanisms that is controlled by the CCP, either directly or indirectly, that would allow them to manipulate sort of the information that is being promoted on that platform. For example, I think a lot of people have noticed that a lot of pro-Palestinian content is being promoted on TikTok, and a lot of pro-Israel content is not being promoted on TikTok. And I believe that one of the reasons for that is that it's within the Chinese Communist Party's interest to promote pro-Palestinian content that would divide Canadians and get them to support a autocratic Islamic regime that engages in terrorism in a uniquely often sort of manner. So I think that TikTok does pose that threat. However, there is the principle of liberty in that Canadians ought to be free to download whatever apps and use whatever services that they want to use. And I think that when governments are going around banning certain social media platforms, especially, social media is supposed to be the sort of new public square where people get together and share ideas and share, all sorts of things. So when Canadians are being restricted from accessing a public square, that is sort of something that should raise some concerns. So I don't necessarily have strong opinions on this. I think, if I were, gun to my head, choose something, I think I would go ahead with getting TikTok to be divested or have it banned. But at the end of the day, I think that this is something that Canadians need to be, this is a process that Canadians need to be brought into. I think that Canadians ought to be informed about the benefits and the risk of keeping TikTok legal in Canada, and an informed decision should be made from there.
Yeah, I mean, and we talk about social media sort of being the new public square. I feel like that's mostly true of X, where there is so many different types of opinions and freedom of expression is actually allowed. Conservatives can actually speak on X without worried about their accounts being banned. The same can't really be said for Facebook or obviously then as Instagram, and certainly not TikTok, in which conservative accounts are usually banned very quickly upon making an account. But one of the things to consider here is, this report is sort of lauding the efforts in the US to ban TikTok. When we look at why the US wants to ban TikTok, we also have to look at Facebook. If TikTok was banned, that gives just that much more power to Facebook, which owns Instagram, as we've mentioned. A lot of young people are on Instagram. A lot of people are on Facebook. Without TikTok, Facebook basically controls everything. And in the last US election cycle, we know that Facebook was actively basically campaigning for the Democrats. They actively suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story on Facebook. So this would actually probably be a bad thing for the Republicans long term. I wonder if the same thing can be said for Canada. Would it be a bad thing for the Conservatives if TikTok was banned here? William, what do you think?
It's such an interesting topic, whether or not, we should be looking at banning or limiting one social media company versus the other. I think probably the user base for almost all of them is probably more skewing left than right, more progressive than conservative. But occasionally I get invited to speak to grade 12 classes in social studies on politics and government. And, one of the things I'm often told by students, they say, well, nothing that's debated by politicians really matters to me. I don't really care about this. And I say, well, what if they ban TikTok? How many of you have TikTok on your phone? And of course, every single person in the class has TikTok on their phone. So if you ever think the government can't impact your day-to-day life or something you personally enjoy, wait till the government takes away one of your favorite apps and then see about it. But just in terms of the security risk of TikTok, we know China is a bad actor. We know that this is a country that has interfered in our elections, that has been caught spying on other companies through technology. That was one of the big concerns we had about Huawei. and their activities, both here in Canada and other places, it isn't beyond imagination that they could use an app like TikTok to for nefarious purposes, to collect information and then to go ahead and use it in some way that is detrimental to Canada and Canadians. So, on balance, I think we have to look and see what can be done to keep Canadians safe. And we have to start approaching China more from the perspective that this is not a friendly government. This is not a government who wants to be an honest partner with Canada. This is a government with an agenda, and it will move forward with that. And if it means bad things for Canada in the process, well, then they're going to go right ahead and do that. So China is not our friend. China is a foreign government that we need to be taking far more seriously than we have been up until now.
I don't know if we're going to necessarily see that serious tone come from the Liberal government. This report also had an interesting note. The Prime Minister and his cabinet could enforce this measure without needing to pass any legislation through Parliament. They could instead simply invoke the Investment Canada Act, which would bar investment considered an injurious to national security. So it wouldn't be that difficult for them to do this, but we know that Trudeau particularly hasn't taken China seriously. Noah, do you think we're going to see any movement from the federal government on this report?
Well, I don't think so, because I don't think it's within the Liberal government's political interests. And if it's not within their political interest, they're not going to do within the best interests of Canadians. And the reason being is that the Trudeau government, they're seen as being very fickle and being very soft on matters of foreign interference. And for them to, stand up at a press conference one day and say, on the switch of a dime, we're taking this issue very seriously. We're coming and we're going to ban TikTok. I think it would, magnify scrutiny over some of their actions to, for example, not deal with the Han Dong situation very seriously. They knew that he was probably, put in that position with the help of the Chinese government, and they didn't take any action. They didn't take any action against foreign interference in the 2019 and the 2021 general elections. So just to put a magnifying glass on the foreign interference issue, especially with China at this time where their government is already facing a lot of scrutiny, I think that it is not within their political interest. So they're not going to move on this issue. But if the Trudeau government, they have more information about this than any of us. So they probably know more than anyone whether or not this is a genuine issue to national security, if there's a general threat to national security that TikTok poses. And if they knew that this was a threat to national security, they probably ought to have acted on this already, just like they knew that foreign interference from China and Iran and Russia was a threat many, many years ago. So I think it would just put a magnifying glass on why they haven't acted on this sooner, why they haven't acted strongly on other matters of foreign interference. And ultimately, I think it would tank their polling numbers even harder, if that's even possible.
All right, we've talked about national security, we've talked about Meta, we've talked about abortion, and I promised you guys that it was going to be a lighter show. We haven't really delivered. Luckily, we did save one hilarious story for the very end that should make up for all the heavy content that we had earlier in the show. Noah, take it away.
All right, so I'm glad to be talking about this story because we're talking about group sex parties. That's right. There was this club in Calgary in 2015 that received a complaint to the city. Basically, there was a complaint that there was sex parties, and it took the city 4 years to act. But after 4 years, they were given a stop order because they were hosting at someone's home, at someone's Calgary home, group sex parties. I guess the specific term is ethical non-monogamous sex parties at this house in the northwest community of Silver Springs, and they called it Club Ménage. So on a bi-weekly basis, every 2 weeks, about 20 to 50 people will gather to this house and really duke it out. They'd go to town on one another. And I think this raises a lot of different concerns. First of all, about the type of, let's just say, diseases, the type of immunity compromising sort of viruses that might be going around the community, but also just raises concerns that your neighbor perhaps could just one day decide to open a club beside your house, and on a bi-weekly basis, you have to hear strange noises coming out of the top floor of their home. So, I believe a court they found that the city is not necessarily allowed to, if this was an establishment put up on commercial on a commercial property, that there would be no problem with Club Ménage be opening. The only problem with Club Ménage is that they opened this establishment in a residential area. So, guys, I don't necessarily have much experience with sex parties, so maybe you guys could provide some more insight into this. Maybe you can, William. But what do you guys think of the sex parties in Calgary's residential area?
Well, to start, the judge actually ruled that these can continue so long as it's not called a club. If they're just sort of parties and not labeled club, they're allowed to continue. But, stories like these are pretty much why I'm a social conservative, not a libertarian. I think that this should just be banned, especially in a residential area. I can't imagine, you've got a young family raising kids, and this is sort of the depraved activity that's going on next door. As I said on my show, Alberta Roundup, today, I think might see some homes go up for sale in Silver Springs, and you might get one for cheap because probably no one's going to want to live around this. But you're certainly going to be taking your share of hits for living there. William, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you walked into that house, I bet there's a home that has plastic on all the furniture. 20 to 50 people in a single home engaged in group sex activity. That is definitely not a recipe for hygiene. Look, I think that generally we ask government to stay out of our personal lives and out of our homes. And had they simply been having extracurricular fun with a smaller group of people and not calling it a club, I'm not sure anybody even would have noticed what was going on. It could have just looked like someone having a party. But, the fact that there are 20 to 50 people, that's an awful lot of people. Think of the traffic. I mean, that's the size of a university house party, 50 people crammed into a single place. That's quite a disruptive activity. And then to operate as a commercial enterprise in a private home means they're not having to adhere to any of the rules that are established for commercial enterprises with regards to cleanliness. And, do you have enough bathrooms for 50 people? Do you have all of the things that businesses would be held to? So I'm not convinced that the biggest issue was their choice of activity so much as the number of people involved and how they charge to do it. I mean, they were charging, is my understanding too. They were charging quote unquote membership fees to participate. So it's interesting. I guess, you never really know what goes on in your neighbor's house. But if you see 50 people showing up every 2 weeks and coming out with big smiles on their faces, I guess maybe you have an idea of what's going on in Northwest Calgary.
I wonder
$30.
I wonder
Go ahead,
if a
Noah.
council or a provincial legislature can legislate on this matter. I mean, first of all, the person drafting up the legislation would, just be tearing their hair out, and it wouldn't be great fun unless you're into this kind of thing. Then it might be great fun. But like, do you just if you're a neighbor of these people, do you file a noise complaint once every 2 weeks? Do you perhaps lobby for a bylaw to be passed where you're only allowed to have sex parties up to 25 people or something like that, to really keep it down? If you're attending a sex party, you're not allowed to park on the street or something like that. Maybe that'd be a good way to discourage this sort of behavior. But what's even more concerning to me about rather than just the sex parties, that it took the city 4 years to get around to this issue. I mean, the original complaint by neighbors was filed in 2015, and then it took all the way until 2019 for a stop order to be issued by the city. I mean, imagine you're the neighbor, you had to deal with that for 4 years straight, and you asked the city 4 years ago to take some action on this, and they just haven't done anything. So once a week on every other Friday night, you're trying to sit down with your wife, have some wine, eat a nice dinner, and then you hear strange noises coming from the left. It's like, oh, that is
Well,
happening.
the good
It's
news
happening.
is that they had 4 years to put their house up for sale, and even longer before this, address and neighborhood became public before anyone else knew what they were getting themselves into. I think
But
we
it
need
tanks
to
the
start
property
asking.
values.
Yeah, but it decreases property value once everyone knew about it. But beforehand, I mean, people who are coming to view your home probably aren't coming to view it in the hours of 12 a.m. to 4 a.m. So still could have gone out of there pretty easily. All right, everyone, we're going to have to come up with some more lighter stories for you guys. So if you to drop some suggestions in the comments below, we'll take a look at that for next week. Don't forget that everything you heard today was off the record. William, if I made a TikTok account, realistically, how long do you think it would take before it got banned?
Well, my understanding is TikTok doesn't ban for political reasons very often. In fact, the biggest thing that gets people banned from TikTok is nudity or sexually explicit content. As with every app, there is a large cohort of people who use TikTok to sell adult services, OnlyFans subscriptions, and everything else like that. So TikTok spends an awful lot of its time issuing takedown orders to people who violate its nudity and sexuality things. So as long as you're not doing
So
that, you're probably fine.
I
I
should
can't
be
live
fine.
between the sex parties. That's unfortunate.
Those ethical non-monogamy parties are in trouble.